that I, and everyone in this room, is a coward. We imprison people, the poorest of the poor, people who make small mistakes, and we send them to prison so that we can feel better about ourselves. We take those who've committed crimes, yes, but not violent crimes, not crimes that keep us awake in our beds, not crimes that threaten the fabric of our society, but those who commit non-violent crimes, and we lock them up just so we can feel better. Steph and I don't agree with this. We think that there's a huge problem with prison. Firstly, we think in prison, people learn behaviours. They're surrounded by the worst criminals, and they learn from them. So we take people who perhaps didn't have the chance to go to university, like you and I, and instead of educating them, instead of giving them a second chance at life, we send them to the University of Prison, where they learn skills in how to commit crimes, where they make contacts in how to commit crimes, where they face pressures to commit more crimes. And when they go back into the world, without any help from us, just judgment, with feeling isolated and removed from society, and they commit another crime because of these pressures, we again judge them and send them right back there, right back to hell, ladies and gentlemen. The second problem we see with prison is that prison institutionalizes people. That is, it takes away their choice. What time you get up in the morning, what you wear, what you can eat, what you can do, when you can see your family, all of these are removed from you. But most importantly, as Steph and I see it, the ability to look after yourself, the ability to care for yourself and provide for your family is removed from you in prison. So when these individuals go back into the world, they do so without these skills. We think that's a problem. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we think when we send people to prison, they're out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to think about them. We don't have to think about the conditions they're in, and we essentially, ladies and gentlemen, put them in a different society from ours. So when they come back, there is this divide, and they never overcome it most of the time. So what do we propose to do? First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to introduce community service. The type of community service this will be graded. That is, some people will do different skills, such as help the elderly, help clean our streets. But those with skills, ladies and gentlemen, we will use them to help the community they have hurt. So those who perhaps have committed fraud and things like this, ladies and gentlemen, we will allow them to educate people because they have the skills to do it. These people who understand finance, who can understand these things, we believe leaving them in prison deprives us, the society, of those skills. No, thank you. The second thing, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do is it's not going to be all fun and games, okay? Like, we understand that they've done wrong. So there will be a curfew, ladies and gentlemen. They will have to work. We are going to means test their living expenses. That is, if those who are too poor, we will give money to them so that they can live and they can help their family. We will tag them so that we can track them, ladies and gentlemen. And in cases of egregious repeat offences, rather than use prison, we will again use community service, and we will use mechanisms such as fines, which we think would be very effective.
Anna,
yes?
What makes you think if it didn't work the first time around, that it's going to work the next 17?
Well, currently, the situation when it doesn't work is we put them back in hell. Currently, when it doesn't work, we don't say have that second chance. We throw them back in prison. And that cycle keeps going. We think this will work for two reasons, right? And this is where I'm going to analyse the types of people who commit non-violent offences. The first type of person who commits a non-violent offence is a young individual who tends to be their first offence. We think in these, first or second minor offence, we think in these situations, what is best to do is educate these individuals, educate them away from career criminals, educate them in an environment where they don't believe committing crime is normal, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that for these individuals, we can rehabilitate them. Stefano's going to talk more about that. For the second type of individual, these are the people who commit fraud and such types. We believe these individuals tend to be middle or upper class individuals whose reputation means a lot to them. We believe that community service can have a shaming effect on these individuals and will create a major deterrent. What the opposition will tell you is that prison is a big deterrent because it is so bad, ladies and gentlemen. What we say is that most criminals don't think they're going to get caught. And what we do at the minute is we spend all of our money on prison and none of our money on rehabilitation, which will actually stop people reoffending. And secondly, when we aren't spending all this money on prison, we have more money to spend on the police, more money to spend on law enforcement, more money to spend catching people, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the biggest deterrent that people will have. The second thing I would say in that, Stephanie, in direct response to your point, is that the problem is how we feel compassion is. We feel compassion for those we know. That's why we feel closer to those living in our own countries, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we feel closer to those living in our own communities. It has been shown that it is incredibly effective to have people see their victims, see the harm they've done, and try and repay that harm. We don't think that happens in prison. We think in prison you were removed from that society, you were removed from that harm you've done. We also think that in prison you think of yourself as a prisoner, as a criminal. If you are doing community service and you see that you can do positive things for the community, you can change your identity, you can change how you think of yourself, and you can start to think of yourself as someone who can contribute positively to the community. We think this is really important in terms of changing those, particularly those who commit non-violent crimes. With violent crimes, there's a safety aspect which means that we need to remove those individuals from society so that we can deal with their physical aggression and their mindset. With those who commit non-violent crimes, the most important thing is that we deal with their mindset, highlighting to them that the harms that they have done in society, showing them that they can repay that debt to society, and not removing them from people like their family, not tearing families apart, not removing them from society, and showing some compassion, shows them that they too are part of society. Because if you're not part of something, if you feel alienated or removed from something, if you feel that you can never be a member of society, why would you act or follow the rules of society if they're never going to accept you? We think this will help people accept people because we will see the work they're doing and people will feel positive about the work they're doing. We're proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank Ruth for that speech, what I think was a very strong introduction to that debate. To respond to that introduction, I'd like to invite Stephanie Bell to begin the case for the opposition team.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So, what you heard from Ruth just now is a very good explanation of a couple of things. Specifically, a very good explanation of the fact that we shouldn't hand out prison sentences to people that aren't merited by their crimes, that is to say, that we shouldn't be harsher than their crimes deserve. And you heard an explanation of why our current prison system, at least in some countries, is not bad, or rather is bad. What you didn't get from Ruth is a very compelling explanation as to why, A, that means we get rid of prisons, B, that means we only do it for nonviolent offenders, and C, that the system that she manages to come up with is any better than the one that we already have. You'll note, if you take a look at what you just heard from the previous speaker, that she's taken some liberties with the community service system that currently exists within any Western country to try and deal with criminal offenders. That is to say, she's gone about improving it. What Seb and I think is that we should actually just go about improving prisons. We think they're good institutions. We have good models in places like Norway and like Finland that tell us how we might be able to do this better, and we think we should follow those systems. So, 3 major points as to how. First, we think that they don't establish a good distinction between violent and non-violent offenders, which means that some criminals are getting punished far more than they deserve, others are getting punished far less. Second, we think that prisons themselves are uniquely suited to making people both receive the punishments that they deserve, that their crimes merit, and to ensuring that they get the rehabilitation and skills training and reintroduction to society that they need. Finally, we think that the impact of the motion will show you that this is just a fundamentally impractical idea that's going to make society worse for all of us, including the criminals. So let's quickly just talk about who we're talking about within the scheme of this motion. Ruth makes this sound like the only people that get affected by this motion are these sort of petty criminals, you know, your average pickpocket, or maybe a small-time drug user, as she puts it, I believe, the poorest of the poor, the most disenfranchised in society. What Ruth doesn't tell you, of course, because it hurts her case quite substantially, is that the other people that we're talking about are people who commit massive fraud against society and other individuals. We're talking about people like stalkers, who don't cause any physical harm to their victims, but who manage to psychologically traumatize them. And we're talking about people like, for instance, gang leaders or mafia leaders, who are not capable, in terms of our investigations, of tying beyond a reasonable doubt to a violent crime. But we know who those people are, and we can get them on things like tax evasion. Those are the people who, in the status quo, we send to prison for nonviolent offenses. The poorest of the poor that Ruth is concerned with, and I think we ought to be concerned with, quite frequently doesn't go to prison, or don't go to prison. And Sebastian and I are happy to support that those people do not go to prison. We do, however, think that the Bernie Madoffs of the world, that the Yakuza leaders, that the Southside gang leaders in Chicago, those people deserve to go to prison, even though their crimes are nonviolent. Sure.
Given that violence in prison equals power, when you put non-violent offenders in there, aren't you encouraging them to be violent in order to survive?
So I was just about to get to that. What we think is important is that we actually try, since you're able to sort of create a good community service system, we think a good prison looks something along the line of the following, much like it does in Norway. First off, you don't throw people in prison forever, because that means that they aren't able to go back into society and sort of function in the real world. Second, you don't put violent offenders in with non-violent offenders. I'm pretty sure that Bernie Madoff would not be able to hold his own in a fist fight in Rikers, which is where he would go if he were a violent offender. That's why we keep him separate from the other people, because he's only a financial criminal. We think that if you put small-scale, or if you put non-violent offenders in a separate institution, you don't end up with those problems. What we also think is that the way in which you're able to, so let's just go to this principled distinction. What we have in terms of the idea of violent versus non-violent, the only justification that Ruth gives you as to why you should put a violent person in prison, but non-violent people shouldn't be in prison, is because of the safety of the rest of society. But what we think on side opposition is that non-violent crimes are often far less safe for the majority of society than violent crimes are. They end up affecting many more people. They also end up destroying people's livelihoods in ways that violent crimes cannot. So if I were given a choice to be a victim of a crime of somebody who was able to destroy the entirety of my livelihood, who took away all of the money that I could invest, or somebody who's psychologically traumatized, who stalked me to the point where I was visibly in fear for my life at any given moment, but no threat had ever been made, nor necessarily would ever materialize, I would much prefer to be punched in the face by someone than to have either of those other things happen to me. And what they don't do for you on their side is demonstrate why it should be any different from that. The second thing I'd like to say is that prisons are uniquely suited environments for being able to rehabilitate people. What happens in prison is that, first off, you can't commit new crimes of the nature that you committed before. Second, you are able to be forced to go to treatment for the crimes that you committed, whereas it's not clear to me in their model how we can make somebody go to community service other than doing something that very much resembles imprisoning them and then dragging them there, which I think is a very sort of squirrely way to get around this problem on their side. Third, you can force people to reflect on the crimes that they committed. And we think this is tremendously important. If you aren't removed from the society that leads you to commit crimes, that gives you incentives to commit crimes, and then able to reflect upon why you might have done it, chances are you're going to go ahead and do those crimes again. We think it makes more sense, if you want to stop people from offending again, to remove them from those environments. Finally, we think that it allows for much more intensive treatment for people who really need it, for people who might have some kind of psychological troubles or something like that. What they say is, well, we're able to rehabilitate on our side, but I don't see any reason why they're able to better rehabilitate via community service compared to a more intensive, structured, and guaranteed model that you can get by putting people in prison. So just finally, what does the world look like if you go with side proposition? First, it means that criminals who construct incredibly violent apparatuses that we can't tie them to, these are gang leaders, these are mafia leaders, these are Yakuza leaders, they roam free. The way in which we get those people in jail, at least in the Western world, is on things like tax evasion. Their side would have those guys working every 2 hours a day in a soup kitchen, and then organizing their crime for the rest of the time. The second thing we say is that those massive fraudsters who manage to rip you off entirely, they should probably go to prison too. The last thing you want is one of those guys continuing to be a stockbroker. The third thing is that the public doesn't feel that these people are appropriately punished if you side with side proposition, because a couple hours of community service compared to removal of freedom is truthfully very little, ladies and gentlemen. We think they neither give you principle nor pragmatic reasons to propose this motion. We're happy to oppose.
I thank Steph for her speech, arguments that differentiate non-violent and violent actors. I certainly think that people who commit crimes against fashion cause a great deal of psychological harm and should be locked up for a very long time. To respond to Steph's speech, I would like to invite Stefano Adriano to close the constructive part of the case for the opposition.
So Steph's very well trained in PR. She says, what prison offers is a nice, structured environment. What she means is an oppressive environment. What she means is an environment which strips you of your dignity, which means you don't even have the basic rights of privacy, or free movement, or the right to see the people you love. We don't think the criminals who do things like steal cars necessarily, ladies and gentlemen, deserve that. So what she does then is she tries to very cleverly give us some examples of where this doesn't apply, this might seem like something which doesn't go to justice. So firstly, she says, well, fraudsters are going to be acting as stockbrokers now, and that's really bad. Like, we're tracking them, right? We're chipping their legs and we're watching their computers. So if they're continually going to the same grounds where they used to do that, funnily enough, I think we'll find them. Similarly, if stalkers are going near the house of the person they stalked, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to get them, seeing as we have that information. And then thirdly, she says, well, how are you going to get drug dealers? Well, we think that if somebody ordered the death of someone, that does also count as someone who perpetrates a violent crime and will also arrest them. And then she tries to very cleverly get around this, and she says, well, what we actually get those people on is tax evasion. Yeah, we get them on tax evasion. They go into prison for 6 months where they can still sell drugs and they leave. We don't see how that changes on this side of the house. So then what she says is, she tries to be very clever, and she says, why if it didn't work the first time, it's not going to work the next 17 times? I mean, I think if they fail to rehabilitate 17 or even maybe 2 times, we'll probably lock them up, right? But so Ruth told you what we're talking about are generally people on their first offences, okay? And then so, moreover, there was never really any response to what Ruth told you, right? So Ruth told you that prison is itself an inhumane environment, and she never does that balance. So we tell you prison strips you of your basic freedoms. Freedoms like privacy, freedoms like your ability to see the ones you love, freedoms to just self-identify as a normal person. We think violent crimes are different, and she never gets that distinction, right? So we give you lots of reasons as to why violent crime is necessarily different. But just to go on to this, what's particularly different about violent crime is that you only need to be near a person to commit it, right? So what the inherent difference there is it's very difficult to track someone and respond in time. What we're talking about are crimes which are often more methodical, crimes that take longer to plan. So what that means is our method of tracking does get them. She also says, well, we can follow Finland, and all this is an argument to improve prisons. Well, given that every single time we try and divert any money towards helping criminals or improving prisons, the public tend to paint prisoners as even more of a burden, the right-wing media tends to characterise them even more as evil people, and it's even more difficult for them to rehabilitate. We don't think that's necessarily possible, we think that's quite a lazy response. And then lastly, does anybody else notice the tension in her case where she said, what's great about prison is we can force them into rehabilitation programs. And then on the other hand, in the next breath indeed, she says, well, one of the horrible things with this is you drag them away. We think we're going to take the idea that it probably is good to get them into rehabilitation programs. Our line is it's better. So firstly, what are the unique harms of prison which mean that even if we improve prison, it's never going to be good enough? The first one is that you lock prisoners away with their peers, and this has several problems. The first one is that human beings naturally self-identify with people who are like them, right? So what it means is they are constantly spending time with people who are around them, who are like them. They will self-identify as a criminal because those are the people immediately around them. They internalise that identity, and it's even more difficult for them to break it once they get on the outside. Secondly, they do meet like-minded criminals who can either progress them onto more serious crimes, or the other thing that happens is they can actually make like a contact. So this happens. People go into prison, they talk to people like them, they get tips, and they progress into more serious criminals. That doesn't happen onto our side. Moreover, she said, there's actually something necessarily wrong with the discipline structure in prison, right? So there's 2 problems here. Firstly, there's a combative relationship between the guards and the prisoners because they are essentially at war. So what happens then is you get hateful authority figures inbred within these criminals, and that makes it even more difficult for them to rehabilitate into the state once they come out of prison. Secondly, what happens is they never learn to discipline for themselves. So whenever they do something wrong in prison, it's always met with immediate retribution. So they never learn to discipline themselves, which is what they really need to rehabilitate on the outside. We give them that. Lastly on this, we think one of the big problems with prisons, they just naturally entrenches a hate for society and state figures. You are not going to want to rehabilitate into the society that stripped you of all your dignity and made you wash in front of men who embarrassed you. You're not going to want to rehabilitate into the society who brought you into the courtyard and made sure you got beaten up. And just on a fact check, Steph, no, we don't separate violent and non-violent criminals. We only separate sex offenders and criminals, right? So that's how it works in the majority of states. Moreover, what's the unique benefit of our model? So the first unique benefit is we do give them practical skills they can actually use to get a job. Because one of the main problems criminals face is they can't get over their economic need to commit crime. So what do? Well, we actually give them experience they can give to a boss, right? They can say, look, I turn up in time to do something, right? I can carry out at least these kinds of tasks, and I can do it on time, and I can follow orders. I'll just take a step quicker.
So remind me again what you're planning on doing to them if they don't follow the orders?
Well, so we have a fit and proper persons test, right? So if they continue to continually reoffend, then yes, they don't pass our fit and proper persons test. We don't think that's necessarily any kind of horrible concession on our side. We think that's perfectly fair. We think all we said is people deserve more of a chance than we're giving them, right? So that's perfectly fine for us to do. Moreover, we think one of the really good things about not putting them in prison is they just don't conceive of themselves as monsters. So they don't have to be around people who are more similar and think, I am like them. What they also don't have to get is the vitriol of the press and the vitriol of people around them. Because the fact is, it just becomes less normal to think prisoners deserve such a disgusting sentence. When you see prisoners who are locked away, we think it necessarily becomes an acceptable thing to think that they are so evil that it justifies that. When actually the punishment that they justify is reduced, it becomes less severe. We think it's more difficult to rationalise yourself that prisoners are these kinds of monsters. And that makes it easier for them to rehabilitate once they get on the outside. Right? Lastly, and very, very importantly, we teach them to manage money on their own. So they get a wage and they have to manage their budget and their family household budget, and they do that without resorting to crime. Well, that means then that we give them the vital skill to overcome their economic need to commit crime, which has been proven to be the one biggest factor which causes rehabilitation. That's why in almost every single state in the US where we use community service programs, they are 10% less likely to reoffend. The fact is that these guys have been taught care about justice. They say some people have committed crimes and that needs to be redressed. But what we do is we make sure those crimes don't happen in the first instance. Justice is only desired because a crime has been committed. Under our case, you are less likely to have future crimes committed against you, and those around you and that you care about are less likely to have future crimes perpetrated against them. And moreover, they save hundreds of £millions a year, which then makes them more preferable in a public light. It makes it much more difficult for people to justify hating them. And all of those things make it much easier to rehabilitate. Under our side of the house, there is less crime. Under theirs, there is retribution. They are medieval, and we are progressive, and I beg you to stand.
I thank Stefano for his speech and some very powerful analysis on life in prisons and rehabilitation. Now, to respond, to close the constructive part of the opposition case and indeed the debate, I would like to invite Seth Farquhar to take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, today the proposition has brought to you several myths. They've brought to you non-violent criminals who are really very obedient. They're actually great guys, and you know what? All they're looking for is for you to give them a little bit of community service that they can do, and then they'll go along and they'll show up on time, they'll do their bit of community service, and they'll leave new, better people. We think that's fiction. They've also told you that non-violent criminals are just never dangerous. They're not really harmful. Not harmful in the same way that violent criminals are. We think that's a fiction too. I'm going to go through 5 points of specific rebuttal to Stefano's speech before moving on to 2 constructive points of my own, looking at deterrence and at the threat this poses to communities. So let's begin with the biggest problem of their case. And the biggest problem of their case is that they have no mechanism for enforcing their policy. They say non-violent criminals will have to go to community service. And if they don't go to community service, well then they have more community service assigned to them. That sounds like it's going to work, doesn't it? After all, they didn't show up the first time. As Steph pointed out, they're not going to show up the next times. Then they told us that they wanted to make an exception. Okay, they don't want to have community service for non-violent criminals who are not fit and proper persons. Now this is, no thank you, one of the most ad hoc solutions to the problem I can think of. It's not a real solution. These are still non-violent criminals. In saying that, Stefano essentially went back on his case and agreed with us that their policy is not tenable, that there are some non-violent criminals, no thank you, that you cannot deal with without compulsion and without forcing them to do things by threat of violence. And that's sort of without engaging them in the prison system. No thank you. They also told us that prisons are really degrading to human dignity, and that there was a real problem with curtailing people's privacy, people's freedom of movement. And then they told us that we weren't going to have a problem tracking down all of these non-violent, potentially dangerous criminals, because we were going to be putting chips in their legs, and we were going to be reading everything on their computers. I think they need to learn something about what dignity is, and what a life worth living is. Because what they ended up describing, no thank you, seemed to be little more than a prison in your own home. I think they're missing part of the point. Then we had some really interesting substantive material about catching gang leaders, about people who often get away scot-free for violent crimes, but end up getting captured for non-violent crimes at the end. And we gave you the example of Al Capone, who got away with murder, literally, dozens of times, but in the end was captured and remained in prison because he was caught for tax evasion. We think that allowing non-violent criminals to be in prison gives us a powerful, useful way, I'll take you in a moment, to take criminals off of the street where we know they're doing bad things, where we know they're actively hurting people, and to make a difference to people's lives. Yes, sir?
So it's against their human dignity to read their emails, but it's not to trap them in a room with a man who watches them undress and urinates next to his pillow.
So, we've already made several points about prison systems. One is that we accepted your argument that some prison systems are bad. We agree entirely that some prison systems are bad, and we reject that. What we want is prison systems which Steph described, where she gave us examples of the sorts of countries which have progressive prison systems, which implement policies that help people rehabilitate themselves, like in Norway, which have powerful records of success, which we think their policy simply would not. And now I want to look at a little bit about what they thought the benefit of their system was. They think that prisons institutionalize crime. And the reason they think this is true is because they think that the environment that the criminals are in encourages them to remain criminals. To an extent, we agree with this entirely, which is why we find it very problematic that what the proposition wants to do is to let criminals stay in the same communities that they grew up in, which turned them into criminals. They want to let criminals remain in the homes, in the environments which cause them to make bad decisions, without giving them the chance to step outside of that environment, as Steph described, to be removed from that environment, to be able to learn new things, make new decisions, no thank you. We think that, for example, the way we segregate people in prisons to separate the non-violent from violent criminals, which is the status quo, no thank you, is a powerful way that we can reduce the institutionalization. And lastly, there's this strong issue they have of understanding which crimes are particularly dangerous. Because as Steph told us, just because a crime doesn't involve being punched in the face does not mean it does not hurt people. They're operating on the false assumption that violent crimes are the crimes that are most dangerous to society. And that's just not true. Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about deterrence. One of the things that prisons do is stop people from committing crime in the first place because they do not want to go to jail. Now I'll make a couple of observations about the system they have in mind. It sounds awfully like getting a free job that the government gives you without any qualifications or application process. They say you're going to get a wage. They say you're going to get something you can put on your CV and show to future employers. Now, it might not be the best job in the world, but it's a heck of a lot better than a life of deprivation where you can't find any work, you can't find a job. They told you that that criminals don't think they're going to get caught. But let me tell you, criminals think they're going to get caught when they're planning on getting caught. Frankly, the thing they describe sounds like a fairly soft option. And we don't think that it's going to be an adequate deterrent. In fact, we think some people might think that the system they have described is better than the lives they're leading right now. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the threat to communities that this provides. Because they've essentially made the assumption that because someone's a non-violent criminal, having them looking after your grandmother is not a problem. This is just not true. You don't want somebody in the nursing home that your parents, your grandparents live in, who have been convicted of theft, looking after your grandmother. That seems dangerous. That seems unpleasant in the extreme, and we have statistics to back this up. Approximately 1 in 10 criminals, convicted criminals, who are engaged in community service, reoffend while they're on service. That means that in the nursing home your grandmother is in, there's probably at least one criminal who's going to reoffend, maybe more. That's not a risk we want to take. So ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we think that their case is badly misunderstanding the nature of crime and the nature of non-violent crime in particular. They're living in a fantasy world where non-violent crime is non-problematic crime, and we think they misunderstand the way prisons work. Thank you.
I thank Seth for his fine speech. I'd now like to begin the reply speeches of this debate. Leading the reply speeches, I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition, Stephanie Bell, to offer the negative reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a bit about what prisons currently look like in some countries, and a bit about what prisons currently look like in other countries. The arguments that you get from both Ruth and Stefano talking about prisons are almost entirely the prisons that Sebastian and I consider to be probably much like the prisons that Ruth and Stefano dislike. That is to say, they're inhumane, they're degrading, they're overcrowded, they're abusive. But we told you this isn't the only kind of prison you can have. You can have prisons that are better funded, that focus on rehabilitation, and that make sure that people actually get the skills they need to go out into the world. We gave you countries in which prisons like that currently exist, like Norway, Sweden, Finland. I'll add another one, Denmark. And what they tell you is that we're the ones living in fantasy land, despite the fact that the system that they describe has so many flaws in it and so many contradictions that it's destined to never work. So, 3 main points. First, what is prison, which I think I've covered pretty effectively so far. Second, what is dangerous to society? And third, what does the world look like if you decide for either of our sides? So on the question of prison, what Seb and I tell you is that we want to have a prison that is focused on making sure that people don't reoffend. But one of the major advantages you get in prison is that you isolate people from the environments that caused them to commit crimes in the first place. You can construct a prison that keeps them away from people that would lead them to commit more crimes, as for instance Norway does. But what we think that you get out of our side of the house is a time for people to actually reflect and realize they've done something wrong, and you've removed them from the situation that led them to offend in the first place. We also get the opportunity to force you to go to rehab. They can't do that on their side of the house because of the fact that that looks like prison, which means they can't do it. Their solution to community service appears to be, well, we'll just assign more community service. But if that didn't work for the first time around, it's not clear that if you keep adding days of community service, that they're going to turn up once they have, say, 10,000 days of community service when they didn't like the first 10. The next thing that we tell you is that the ideas of it being violent and degrading is truthfully not the kind of prisons that we want to make on our side of the house. And we can use the money that they would spend on community service schemes to make better prisons, or the money we already spend by just reducing the length of people's sentences. So what is dangerous to society? It's not clear to anyone, either Seb nor I, that nonviolence and violence is the way in which you figure out what is or is not dangerous to society. We've given you several kinds of nonviolent crimes that are incredibly dangerous, either to large-scale groups in society or very devastating to particular individuals. But somehow, despite the fact that mass-scale fraud or being a terrorizing stalker seems like it's probably a pretty bad thing, these guys would rather jail you if you happen to get into a bar fight. That's completely contradictory. It violates the proportionality that I talked about at the beginning of my speech, and it doesn't protect society. So finally, what does the world look like if you oppose? What we think it tells you is that you get a better prison institution, and that's probably for both the non-violent offenders and the violent offenders. You get a better rehabilitative option because you can actually make people go. You get them reflecting on their crimes, which means that they probably are less likely to commit them again. On their side of the house, you have society living in fear because people are committing crimes in the middle of their community service, probably robbing the grandparent of yours that they're supposed to be taking care of. You have the fact that they're going to continue committing crimes if they happen to be a gang leader or something like that, because we weren't able to imprison them for more severe offenses and keep them away from that leadership structure. You also get the fact that you put people back into the environment in which they're more likely to offend, so there's nothing removing the incentives that led them to commit those crimes in the first place. If they committed those crimes because their peers were doing it, they're still with their peers. We think at the end of the day, society is safer and fewer crimes are committed if you leave the prison system in place and just make it a better prison system. We oppose.
I thank Steph for her speech, and indeed both speakers on the negative side of this House. And now, to close the debate, according to the tradition that the proposition team have both the first and last word in the debate, I'd like to invite Ruth to give the proposition summation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we can never make prisons good, and they agree with us. They entirely conceded their case because they told us that violence is a power structure in prison. People do learn from violence in prison. Drug lords do have huge power in prison. So they said we'll separate the violent and the non-violent offenders. But then they told us, well, we actually never catch the drug lords on violent offences. We catch them on non-violent offences. So they'll actually be in the non-violent prisons because they'll be there on tax evasion. So that's exactly why we think you can't fix that particular problem in terms of segregation. The second thing, though, they said is we'll fix all the prisons. We'll pay more. We'll spend more money on prisons. And we say, no, we won't. We don't want to spend more money on prisons. No one ever votes to spend more money on prisons because, it's, like I said in my first speech, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. We don't ever have to think about those criminals. When criminals are in our community, when we have to engage with them, when we meet them every day, then we start thinking about rehabilitation. That makes us more willing to spend that money because we have to deal with it, ladies and gentlemen, rather than just simply having them out of sight, out of mind. Then they said, this is the second point, there's no difference between violent and non-violent offenders. And they said, like, people like, it won't be much of a deterrence because we're just going to have people working in soup kitchens for 2 hours. Okay, look, we clearly didn't say that, okay, that's a bit fallacious, that's not what our argument is. But we think in terms of people who commit huge frauds, they do so because they want money, they do so because they want power, they do so because they want reputation. We are denying them all of these things. We are protecting society in terms of tagging and in terms of monitoring them. What we're not doing is needlessly imprisoning people. They gave us absolutely no justification for why we needed to take the punishment to this extreme, why we needed to deny people's human rights on this level. All they said is that we need to protect society. We're telling you we can do that on our side of the house, both through monitoring and tagging criminals and through re-educating them. Now, Seb tells us that criminals learn from those around them, and if we keep them in their community, they will be surrounded by those who commit crimes. We say in prison, the only people there are people who have committed crimes. We agree, people learn from their communities. In community service, however, you meet other members of the community, members who aren't criminals. Let's think about the types of people who run community service. These are the best of the best people, people who care about their society, people who want to give back. We think that's far better for people to meet than other criminals in prison. Finally, the thing in terms of deterrence, we like to say deterrence is determined on who gets caught. We think having more money by not having to needlessly imprison people means that we can catch the Al Capones, means that we don't have to try and create offences and catch people on things like tax evasion. We can actually punish people for the crimes they commit. They tell us that the situation in Norway and Sweden is brilliant. We tell you, no, actually recidivism rates are rising there. Steph told us that 90% of those who engage in community service never re-offend. That's 90%. We think that's a huge statistic. We think if you compare that to the numbers of re-offences from prison systems, irrespective, like whether they be Norway or anywhere else, we think that's an amazing statistic. What we think in terms of saying that, oh, we're going to have thieves working with your dear grandmother, not quite true. We said it will be graded. We said people who commit large-scale financial fraud can teach people skills like economics and things like this. We think that's far better. Show people that they can contribute positively to society. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the point from Oxford. I loved this. The situation is... well, first of all, he said we were being as bad as prisons, but then he said actually it's going to be too nice and people will commit crimes to get these jobs. We think if we have a society where people are so poor and so disadvantaged that they need to commit crimes in order to get into community service, in order to have a life, we're fine with that. We deserve to have to pay them because that's a horrific society. We're proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank you for a fine speech, and indeed all speakers in the debate. Can I have a round of applause for everyone? I certainly don't envy what you need to do now, because it is indeed you who will be judging this debate via the board. So in fact, can I maybe just warm up the clapping muscles once again? Can I have another round of applause for both of the judges? Now, if you believe the proposition in this debate have persuaded you